The title of my talk today is the new front-end workflow from ticketing to building. I have been sort of iterating on a process of trying to improve front-end development because of a bunch of problems that I've seen while doing front-end development. I've been getting better and better, and like, I'm time to like actually give a presentation about ticketing, right? Previous Next flew me out here for this event. I'm a senior front-end developer. My name is Albin Wilkins. And they also signed me up for some Scrum training. So I did Scrum training on Wednesday and Thursday. And of course, this morning I threw all my slides away. The original talk was going to be, the new front-end workflow, but I actually think it's a bit more general than that. It's really the new website workflow. This should actually make you happy that it's actually what I was just applying to the front end is actually about the entire process. At least from once you get to the sort of development phase of a website. And as a new person to Agile, I'm still trying to figure out how to get the requirements gathering and the development process into a single workflow. I'm still wrapping my brain around that. But we're just going to be talking about the development part. Yep, so this is me. I live in Taiwan. I have been doing Drupal for a long time and web development for a long time. And actually, my history is sort of related to why I'm talking here and why I'm giving this talk. This is actually a variation of the talk I've given like 5 other times, and usually I only give a presentation once and then I'm done and I go on to something else. But this is a really, really important topic for front-end developers and for everybody else who's building websites. So I'm gonna talk about my history a little bit, which is, so back in the day, there we go. 1993, this is when I got started in web development. It's when HTML 1.0 came out. I was a webmaster. And cutting edge really was like Netscape introduced the align attribute. You could, well, first they introduced the image tag, so you could have images. Woo! And then they said you can put it on the right, and then your text can flow around the left. That was what design was at the time. Then around 1995, HTML 2.0 came out, and it had a whole bunch of additional things that were sort of designy features. But every web page was a snowflake, right? All of the HTML, all the design was, and the content was all embedded inside a single text file. So if you had a site, you had a whole pile of snowflakes. During this same period, CSS1 came out and said, hey, we can put our design in a separate file. No browser implemented it. Pretty much everybody ignored it except for the spec writers. HTML 3.2 came out, which was basically, it introduced it introduced the table tag, which designers immediately misused and did it for layouts and for the rest of the stuff. CSS2 came out, and finally there was some CSS that would allow you to do layout. Again, no browser implemented it. Everybody ignored it. HTML4 came out and said, hey, you should use CSS for your design. It actually says it in the spec. No browser implemented CSS2, so everyone ignored it. But they started using HTML4, but they were using CSS. And then finally, some browsers started to implement CSS in around 2000. And in 2001, there was a very influential article on List Apart called "To Hell with Bad Browsers," because there were some browsers that were preventing us from using CSS because they weren't implementing it. And we started, as a developer community, started organizing and petitioning the browsers and said, can we please start using this? And of course, now that we finally started using CSS, that meant that we could put our design in one file. It was reusable, right? This reusability concept, of course, is extremely powerful. It reduces waste, reduces risk, right? So design is shared by all the web pages. And at this time, I've gone on from being a webmaster, which means that I have to edit every single file when there's a design change, to doing CSS and having basically 2 designs for these small sites, the homepage design and the inside page design, right? And my reusability, my efficiency is just having a CSS file. That's as far as I've gotten. In 2007, I became the maintainer of the Zen theme, and I sort of made it big at this time. I became Drupal famous. And I got hired by a large Drupal shop, Palantir, in Chicago. And I actually started doing large projects. And like I went from these sites that had 2 lines. Literally, my first project, my boss came in and she plunked down this 50-page document, 11 by 7-inch document, 50 pages of designs. And said, do that. I'm like, OK. But of course, large projects require lots of planning. Here's the sort of typical ticket structure that I've been using every single project since 2007 for large projects. You have sort of a list of site features. Here's some example site features. Events page, blog page, white papers, podcast. These are all examples of lists. I mean, Drupal is a list building machine when you include the views feature or the views module. Drupal 8 will, of course, have that with it, and it just builds lists of everything, content. And you would have a ticket for, build the events page and then theme it. Build the blog, theme it. Build blah, 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 theme blah, blah, blah. That was how we did it. The problem that we had here, which I didn't discover, I think maybe I have these slides out of order. Design has, yeah, I think I need to do this slide first. OK. So the problem here is that I would start to look at these designs. Like I said, I threw most of my slides away this morning. The problem that we have here is that since these are all lists, they actually share a lot of design elements. They're sort of like the basic list of content style design, right? And the blog will have it, white paper will have it, maybe the events will have like a calendar icon, so it's a little bit more difficult. Podcast, of course, have a little audio thing. So you end up with some estimates that are like, blog and white paper is about the same time. You're looking at the picture of this thing. Events will take twice as long, podcasts will take twice as long. Roughly, this is the estimates. And what we'll actually find out is that the very first thing that we do, because there's an order priority here, we'll do the first thing, it takes 5 times sort of what we thought the simplest item was. And then the next 2 are already done because we've done the list styling. The CSS is already applying. We just close the tickets. Sort of satisfying, but when you start looking at and then of course podcast, you just have that one little bit that's slightly different. You end up with actual time spent like this. This is really frustrating, of course. Because while you can see here that actually, the numbers here add up to the same number of numbers. So like on the average of the project, you're like, oh, we finished on time, on budget. It's all right. It doesn't matter that every single one of our tickets is wrong as far as estimation. But the problem here is that if you have a project that sort of goes sideways, your tickets are equally messed up in a bad project as they are in a good project. So how do you actually analyze what the heck goes on here as far as like telling you what went wrong in the bad project versus what went right in the good project? Because all the numbers are all wrong. Right? So the average completion time is a terrible estimate. Right? It just doesn't help us figure out what we need to do. So yeah. So then in 2009, OOCSS's object-oriented CSS was introduced by Nicole Sullivan. This was a way to basically say, hey, let's take our designs and try to find repeatable bits that we can use, and we could sort of subclass them. It was very developer terminology, where you would have like a base element, and then you would sort of subclass it, and you have another sub-object, subclass. Jonathan Snook came out with the SMACSS CSS, and in the 2012 components, this is a W3C spec, which basically says, hey, web developers, they really like using template systems. Let's add this to the spec. And basically, it sort of formalized this idea that you can have reusable chunks of HTML and CSS and sort of use those in multiple places on your page just by inserting this little template. I'll get into this more specifically in a second here in my next slides. But during this time, I'm still doing it the old way because I haven't glued in yet. And finally get to this spot where my boss asked me, hey, can we evaluate your performance based on the actual tickets that you do to see if you match the estimates? I'm like, sure, because I always come in time. At the end of my project, there should be no problem. And if I had waited until the end of the project to have the conversation with my boss again about, hey, I came in on average, it's all right, everything would have been fine. I probably would have been still doing it the old way. But about halfway through, I realized that all my tickets were wrong and that my evaluation was going to be horrible because I had missed every single ticket. So I immediately started thinking, what am I doing wrong? And I finally discovered these things and realized that because I'd been looking at it from this sort of ticket structure of features and stuff, I wasn't analyzing the design I was actually given, because it's waterfall process, of course. All the designs are given to you front. I wasn't actually starting to look at my designs. Here's an example design. This is a PRI website. And what I started to do is like, well, how do I find repeatable bits and make those reusable, right? So I started to look at stuff, and for example, here at the top we have a featured story. It's got some sort of standard teaser text, title, image, and then there's this little share icon that's over here, and this is a taxonomy term. We've got some sort of standard date things. You can see these are being repeated. Here's a completely different layout, but it's got this styling here. It's got the share count, another taxonomy. I don't know why it's flickering every time I press the button, but sorry about that. But these are repeatable, right? So if I can identify those and say, okay, I'm going to just create some CSS that's that bit of design, and then reuse it all the places that it's used. Actually, later on in the page, it's a very long page, the share count is actually on the top left in some other places. But it's the same look. It's just positioned slightly differently. We just need to find those repeatable bits and also how it varies. For example, that share count, it's on the left on sometimes, but 90% of the CSS is the same. Oops, this is another slide that I forgot to remove. This is the way I was doing it previously, right? It seemed like a good idea time. So this idea of repeatable design components, I've seen a lot of front-end developers start to come together and like, we can do this. We can have these design elements that we reuse. The only thing that we haven't come together is what we're actually going to call that thing. I'm calling them design components. But that's the same thing as an object in this object-oriented CSS. It's the same thing as module in Jonathan Snook's SMACSS. The same thing as block in BEM's block element modifier. UI patterns, these are all describing the exact same concept, reusable design elements. And this is really the key to how we should be doing websites in general. If you look at it from a CSS standpoint in particular, yeah, we won't go over that. If you're interested in actually how to do this in CSS, I gave a session, a presentation at DrupalCon Austin about how to do web design components. And you can go to DrupalCon, Austin 2014.drupal.org. And you'll find a link to my session there that will tell you how to do this with CSS. Or if you wanted to tell a colleague, hey, you're a front-end developer, go look at that and see how to actually build that. We're not going to go over that today because that's not what this session's about. But obviously it's related, right? But just in general, from a very high level of how you actually do this in CSS, is we're trying to pick a single CSS class that represents that design component. And so whenever I apply that CSS claim, I want to make sure I want that exact same design. It doesn't matter that sometime this design element is in the sidebar or the footer or wherever. It always has to be exactly repeatable. Now, let's say that, for example, I did want it to have a smaller font when it's in the sidebar. That's considered a variation. So now what you've got is the sort of default styling for that element, and a variation that is, smaller font variant, right? And because you've named it generically, it's a design semantic. This has, it's smaller, the smaller version of this. You could still put that anywhere on the page. It doesn't have to just be in the sidebar. You've made it repeatable. You're fixing it to a location on the page. That's the thing you want to avoid. You don't want to have your design components. You don't want to have your design components. Maybe it's slipping down. There we go. You don't want to have your design components have a different design depending on where you stick it on the page. That's sort of an anti-pattern. Completely repeatable. Here's some examples of stuff: buttons, nav bars, tabs. Ooh. I don't know what happened to that slide. Anyway, but you can name them whatever you want. Here's a good example of one: breaking news. The name of these design components are using design semantics. I don't care about the content because HTML5 handles content semantics. All of my repeatable design elements have names that I've given them that are related to the design. Right? So I don't want to try to hard code into the name a specific type of content. Right? Breaking news is really just like this red banner across the top page that are used on MSNBC websites. But don't stress about what you name them. Just pick a name, go with it. It doesn't really matter as long as they're sort of design-centric and not content-centric. So I've gone over basically, how I fixed my problem with actually creating CSS. But that immediately brought me into, okay, how do I actually implement this in a project basis? And basically what I've discovered is what we should be moving towards is style guide-driven development. This KSS node, this is the project that we're actually using to implement the style guide on our projects. But style guide-driven development basically means that, and you can use this approach if you have waterfall or if you have agile. How many people here are using an agile approach? Okay. And how many of you know that you're actually not following all the rules of agile approach? Yeah. I'm in the same camp. The good news is that this idea can be used in any sort of workflow. I want to say absolutely 100%, I am sure that every single one of us will be using an agile approach sometime in the future, and we will be following all the rules. This is definitely going to happen. But we're not all there. The good news is you can still do this as you work toward that. So style guide-driven development basically is saying, I've got a feature. I'm going to start working on that feature. What are my design requirements? If you don't already have designs, your designer is actually part of your team. They work together to try and define a solution for how are you going to design this new feature for the website. And you'll work with a front-end developer to actually get it implemented in CSS. And together they can add it to this style guide. And you will build up a style guide as you continue to work on the project. Let me show you an example of a style guide here. Now, the problem with, this is the MSNBC style guide. Let's show you the variables ones. This is very pretty. It's a good page to start with. The problem with traditional style guides is they were separate documents that the designer would put together and then never update again. And they would quickly, like before they even delivered it to you, be out of date. Style guide-driven development requires that you are auto-generating your style guide from the source code immediately as you edit the source code. So it's a continuous integration process of ensuring your style guide is always up to date because it is generated from the code. And that's where this KSS node comes in handy. Okay, so the KSS node project is a project that I recently became a new maintainer for. It's an existing project. It was the first project I could find that of this idea of automatically generating a style guide. It actually worked the first time I used it. I'm like, I'm going with this one. I'm now a maintainer, and I help it. I've made it have an actual official 1.0 release. Yay. And people are using this on all sorts of websites. We're using it previous next. And basically, the way that it works is, let me show you here. These are the docs for KSS node. And there is a specification that says, use this standard format for a comment in your source file. So it doesn't care whether you're using CSS or SASS or less or whatever. It'll read your source code wherever you point it at. And it'll be looking for a comment that is styled like this or formatted like this, and then just generate the documentation from the comments in the CSS. Because you are constantly updating your CSS, you should also be constantly updating the documentation, which is in the same file right there next to the code that you're tweaking, right? If your style guide gets out of date, bad developer, right? There's no reason why you should be out of date, because you should be updating it at the same time. I tried to update. I wanted to like give the most best documentation. I was working on the documentation during the keynote this morning, and I'm like, git push. And like, for some reason, I'm being blocked on the Wi-Fi network. I can't actually push any git commits. So by tomorrow, there will be updated documentation about how this actually works. This is close enough. But basically, this is, you specify, there's a missing heading here. So you specify the name of the component, and then a brief description of it, how basically the way that component looks when you like hover over it, or whether or not you alter it using some JavaScript, the states of it. And then you just tell it like what section of the style guide you want to put this documentation into. It's very easy. I mean, that's the whole thing. Actually, the only other bit of it is that we have a markup section. OK, that was 90%. This is the other 10%. You have like a little clip of HTML that it'll actually use when it's generating the style guide. There are some companies who were using this approach, and they were having issues because they were having developers look at the style guide. They would see this chunk of markup. They would copy and paste it, put it into a new component, and reuse the CSS, but not reuse the HTML. And that ended up like exploding all over the face because somebody would refactor the original HTML and the CSS, and it would break parts of their site. There's an open feature request for KSS nodes, so that basically we'll be able to link, say, markup in that file over there. And this would give us the ability, for example, to link to a TPL file. And it's pull in that as the actual markup. So the real markup on your site would be inputted into the style guide. And the other thing that I didn't mention here yet is that this style guide will be importing the exact CSS that your website imports. Right? It's really easy to set it up to include the exact same CSS from your theme into the style guide. And let's go over to, this is the style guide that we were just working on last week. Let's give a good one. So here's some button styling. All of this is automatically generated from the contents of our CSS. And actually, I could prove that, because go down here, there's a good example. 5.11. Let me show you that as what it looks like in the CSS. So here's our SASS file in this case. We actually have real CSS. How many people here are not familiar with SASS? OK, a few of you. So this little funky thing that says @include respond, basically that's some sort of SASS magic that will replace it with a media query, right? And the fact that it's nested is also some SASS magic. But what you're going to end up with is two rules output right there. One of them, which is dot feature, and then the CSS properties, and then a media query, and then another rule, dot feature, and some extra CSS. That's what's going to happen in the generated CSS. KSS node is going to go through, see this, and go, oh, that's cool. But what I'm really looking for is up here. So same file, and here's the this little chunk here, feature. This is featured content. Here's the default. Sorry, here's the markup that you usually use, and it shows you like all the classes that we're using, because this is a sort of a complex project, or complex design element. So it actually requires multiple HTML elements, and each of those elements should have their own class. And then how it looks differently depending on our design variation. So it looks the normal way this way, and it will start spitting out this. So this is the exact same thing. This is featured content with an image and teaser text. This is it's rendered that chunk of HTML that was in my documentation here, because this page, which is a generated HTML page, it's just static HTML, goes through, looks at all your docs, spits out some static HTML pages. It's importing the same CSS, so it's rendered the HTML. It's applied the CSS. So this is how it will look on your website as well. Now, this particular variation has this dark band on the bottom. I'm not sure exactly what was a design requirement, but it was. So then there was a variation that did not have the dark band, so we called it no band. Like I said, don't stress out about the names. I'm not crazy about this name, but it's understandable. This is another one that has the same thing, but no padding around it, less padding around it somewhere. And then here is a variation. This one actually has slightly different HTML requirements because we needed to take that normal story and actually just sort of like vertically and horizontally center it inside the image that was above it. So it's 90% the same CSS. We've just added some extra HTML elements with the new classes and has a different look and feel. Because this is real CSS, you're building a responsive site, of course. Oops, I got to do one thing first. Focus mode. So I'm going to focus on this thing before it scrolls off the end of my page. There we go. OK. So let me show you that it's a real responsive site. As you get smaller, this is how it looks. Actually, on the real site, it has a different image. I need to fix that in the docs. The image is actually taller on the real website. But you can see that when it gets to a certain spot, instead of being overlay, which is basically like I'm covering the entire image, what good is that? Then it switches down on smaller screens to be like this. So your style guide is showing you exactly how your component responds to different screen sizes. This, of course, is immensely useful when you start talking about workflow. This is immensely useful because as you build out a feature, you add its design to the styling guide. Well, what happens if you have a new feature that you're starting work on, right? The first thing that you should do is look at your style guide and see if you can reuse a solution that's already in your design guide or inside your styling guide. And if so, just apply those classes to the markup. It makes design, if the solution is already available in the style guide, just reuse it, right? And if this is a waterfall approach, of course, you're going to look at the giant stack of documents you have, like, oh, is this the same design that I'm finding inside the generated style guide? Well, yes, it is. Then I can reuse it. If it's agile approach, the front-end developer, UX person should get together, designer should get together, decide, are there existing solutions that we can use for this approach? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is almost. And that's when you make a variation. So you take your existing component, you tweak a little bit to fit this make it a better this feature that you're working on right now. And of course, you document that. So now you've got the original design plus the variation. All of these things are documented fully. Go on to your next feature. Repeat the process. Over and over again, release the site. Right? This is a very simple approach. It will work really, really well. And like I said, you can do this during this awkward transition where we're all moving from waterfall to a purely agile environment. Thank you. So are there any questions? Yeah.
The KSS or whatever that system you have, what does it require to make it run? Is it just run of HTML, CSS? Or?
That is an excellent question. So KSS is a specification that says this is how you format your doc block above your CSS. Right? That's all it specifies. Right? And there are specific implementations and actually read through all your files and generate HTML files. The sort of default it's dropped out again. There we go. The default implementation is a Ruby. So if you KSS project, it comes with a default Ruby implementation. I don't know Ruby. I could not figure out how to get it to work. This is the Node.js version. So either you can use Ruby. The end result of whether or not you use the Ruby code or you use the Node.js code to generate your style guide, the end result is just static HTML, the CSS file that you're already using on the site. So you just sort of hot link into that same CSS file. And then like some JavaScript. It's web browser technology. So, and you can host it anywhere. You can host it on the Drupal site, or you can host it on a separate site, as long as make sure you're hot linking your CSS so that you're getting real CSS, right? Great question.
On the auto update system where you can just copy and paste the HTML and it will link across everywhere, is there a progress on that, or is that an open job that anyone's taken up yet?
There actually is an open pull request on GitHub for this. The way that they did it was a bit too, it was inflexible. So I'm working on trying, when I have spare time, I'm trying to get it to, I would welcome additional people to help, because what I'm trying to do is basically, right now the pull request is basically it's looking for a file in a very specific spot. And I would like it to be more flexible about where it looks for the code. So I would just want to specify, like, I have a line that says markup and then like the name of the HTML file where it pulls it in or whatever it is, right? So the way I sort of envision it, since Drupal is a PHP language, we're going to create some sort of, maybe it would even be a Drupal module, I'm not sure yet, some PHP code that takes the real TPL files, sticks some dummy content into it, and then spits it out to an HTML file, like on the hard drive somewhere. And then that could be sucked in just by pointing at it in the KSS docs. That's the way I would sort of envision it. Yeah. And like I said, this would be awesome because it's using the real HTML then and the real CSS. Right now it's just using the real CSS.
Yes, when you're concentrating on reusable components, you'd be getting a reduction in the amount of CSS that you'd be writing. Do you have any case studies on the ranges of reduction in CSS experience? So the question here, which I'll repeat for the recording, is the premise is that if you do this, since you're reusing components, you're going to end up with less CSS. This is absolutely true. And do I have any metrics that show how much of a reduction can it be? It obviously will depend on the site. But I know that Stubbornella, Nicole Sullivan, she has actually done this on some large sites and seen dramatic, like orders of magnitude reductions in file size, right? Because she was able to repeatable units of stuff and just giant chunks of CSS. So like reducing the file size by 50% easily. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you talk a lot about receiving a stack of design documentation and then implementing this. So if you're presenting this or talking to a group of designers, or does that actual stack of designers still exist?
Right. So my bosses have actually asked me this, how should designers work through this process? And before I was like, well, I don't know how it would work for the process. This is before I had Scrum training. I would answer them and say, I'm not sure exactly how designers would do it. Now I'm positive we're all moving to an agile process. They need to get on board with the same thing that we're all trying to get on board is. It's going to be an agile process. You're going to do your designs iteratively, right? So, and you'll come up with the best solution for just the first feature on the site. So you have one feature on the first, your website is going to consist of like one feature, and you'll have like one really simple design for it, and then you just iterate on that, actually produce a big site. The goal, of course, of Agile is to reduce your risk. So at any time, your website may not be what you sort of fully envision, but it should be, with the features that it currently has already implemented, it should be releasable. Right? So,
How do you sell that to your bosses?
please, Owen. Oh, not my boss. How do you sell that to your bosses? It's all about reducing risk, right? At any given point, the client can just say, stop working, right? You have a product that, with all the features that are implemented already, looks good. Because you're doing this agile process, the design for those features are done. You don't have this problem that I have right now on sites is like, I'm working on the front-end design, or the front-end development of the design, and like the site just looks horrible for like 90% of the project, and then just during the last 10%, then suddenly everything comes together, like, oh, it's pretty now. Whew. Right, that's the way it works right now. With an agile, so then the risk there is that if you stop at 80%, the site looks horrible. It looks like you haven't done any work on it at all. But you just sort of like, you just haven't quite got it all together until the end. So with an agile process, things will look cohesive from the very beginning, just not very featured, right? So
reducing risk. That's how you sell it to your bosses and to your clients. Yeah.
So talking about it looking nice right at the start, do you put responsive design right into your first feature that you create so that it looks nice on any device right at the start?
Yes. The question is, when you start with your initial feature, are you worried about what it looks like on all devices when you work on that feature? Absolutely. You should be thinking about, like, right now we have this difficulty just trying to get our head around responsive design, right? So we've gone from like just one design for a page, and then it's like a range of designs for a range of sizes, right? There's this thing called Internet of Things that is going to make today's problems look like trivial, right? Karen McCrane gives a great talk, and she'll say, one day your content is going to be delivered to toast. This, of course, was a big joke, but then, like the last time I saw her give this presentation, she saw somebody who had actually printed something on a piece of toast, and now she had a screenshot. This is where your content's going to be had. So you need to design for toast, right? So yeah, when you implement the feature, you should be different kinds of media, right? Because right now we have computers, and whether they're small ones that fit in your pocket or large ones, they're still computers. There's going to be other platforms that are coming in the future that have other characteristics. For example, I have a Kindle. It's a black and white. It's a great reading device for books and stuff. There's no reason why we couldn't deliver content to that. It has a black and white limitation eventually, and it's e-ink, right? The next generation of e-ink is going to be color. So now they'll be more similar to computers and yet have different characteristics. They don't have the refresh rate of a computer. They don't have the processing power of a computer. So we're going to have to be thinking about different types of media for our content. And as we develop our features, we need to be thinking about all those different types of media. So start doing Agile now, thinking about responsive, get that all under your belt, and like, okay, I know exactly how to do that, and then get ready for toast.
Sorry, can I just do one follow-up with that?
Yeah.
So you've got you've got other developers or the back-end developers throwing out your content, and how do you make it look pretty at the start when it's content's out there and you're only doing one feature for one point?
So, and the idea here from Scrum is basically each site feature is a user story, right? So you have this story that describes this feature. Included in that story, of course, is making it look good. It really should be part of the process. So you're going to have tasks that say build and then design, and these things are not. They're not like you have to build first and then design and then do the front-end implementation. They're actually a lot more decoupled than you would think. For example, the story should describe how, what the criteria is for acceptance, the acceptance criteria, what is the definition of done for this user story. And if you have that, both the back-end developer and the designer and front-end working together can come up with a design solution that should apply to the actual code that comes out later. So you can work on those things in parallel, and then at the end you will need to wire up your CSS. Well, that's the other thing. The CSS implementation, because you're thinking about it in a reusable way, all you're coming up, the front-end designer is deciding on the class names, right? That's also separate from the back-end code. So all of that work can be done in parallel, and then sort of the last step right before the feature is considered done, the story is considered done, you wire up the classes to the actual code that's spit out by the back-end feature. And now you're done. And you've made it look good in all the different sizes. And your story is complete. And it looks correct before it ever goes into the sort of production environment database or Git repository. I think that is it. It says it's 7:30. So thank you very much.